Hello, this is a presentation of the FY 2027 operating budget for the town of Belmont. I'm Paul Rickter, Chair of the Belmont Warrant Committee. I will be giving a shorter version of this presentation on the floor of town meeting on either June 8 or June 10. To start, to help make it a little easier to navigate the town budget, I've created a Google Doc with links to all the publicly posted town and school budget documents. This list of links is accessible using this URL, tinyurl.com/BelmontFY27. There's also a QR code that points you to the same address. Let me walk through what I'm going to cover in this presentation. I will describe the purpose of the Warrant Committee, the process followed to create the FY27 budget, high-level summaries of revenue and expenditures, a look at our reserves and how they compare to peer towns, the outlook for FY28 and beyond, and finally, I will walk through the expenditures under Article 38, which is when town meeting will vote on this budget. This is a longer version of the report I will deliver in person at town meeting June 8 or June 10 before we vote on Article 38. About the Warrant Committee. We are functionally equivalent to the town's finance committee. Our main purpose is to advise town meeting on the financial impact of warrant articles. To do this, we work with staff and other committees throughout the budget process. In the end, we analyze the town budget and write a report to town meeting on that budget. We also provide independent analysis on financial matters and act as a committee of town meeting, which is the legislative branch of town government. We don't write the budget, but instead act as the eyes and ears of town meeting, which has the final role in voting on the budget. No money can be spent unless town meeting authorizes it, and it is the role of the Warrant Committee to make sure you are educated on the implications of each vote. To create this budget, we follow a revenue-first approach. Starting with an understanding of the available revenues based on projections made by the Multi-Year Budget Advisory Committee, MIBAC. The committees that have a financial roles meet multiple times in a series of budget summits to create spending targets for the coming year. Municipal and school staff then create budgets that meet those spending targets. The FY27 budgets were presented at the March 26 summit, and the Warrant Committee proceeded to analyze and document these budgets with a report that we released to town meeting members on May 21. In a change from prior years, this report is organized by appropriation vote, and it's about 1/3 shorter than last year. Let's look at revenue. Note that about 84% of revenues are property taxes. Both the regular property tax levy, which grows by 2.5% annually, plus an additional amount for new growth, and the exempt debt levy, which is debt costs for projects that have been approved by voters, such as the middle and high school, rink, and library. State aid, local receipts, and available funds complete the list of revenue sources. And here's the revenue in table form. Note that for the first time in years, the levy for exempt debt is virtually unchanged, growing by just $60,000. This growing part of the budget has now stabilized because the borrowing for the middle and high school, library, and rink are complete. Note that available funds includes transfers to reserve funds that vary from year to year. There are fewer of these transfers in FY27, so that's why that category drops this year. Now let's look at expenditures. The education budget is $74 million, or 43% of the operating budget. Municipal departments are 20%. Shared services, which includes staff benefits, facilities costs, and debt service, is about 1/3 of the operating budget. Capital is about 3%, and other post-employment benefits, OPEB, is that tiny sliver at the top at $100,000 this year. And here are the expenditures in table form. A few things to point out here. The total education budget, which includes both the Belmont Public Schools and regional schools expenditures, is shown here rising by 4.9%. But in addition to these expenditures, the shared services budget is increasing by about $375,000 in additional staff benefits for school employees. If those additional expenses were included in the school budget, that budget would grow by 5.3%, which is in line with the multi-year target for the school budget. The shared services item is growing to account for uncertainty due to the move of staff and retiree health insurance from our self-insured plan to the state's plan operated by the Group Insurance Commission, GIC. Also note that the other warrant articles item drops in FY27 due to fewer transfers to stabilization funds, and also because we reduced our contribution to other post-employment benefits, OPEB, from last year's $440,000 to $100,000. That reduction will provide some additional funding for our health insurance move to the GIC. Another way of looking at expenditures graphically is to look at how each dollar of revenue is spent. Of that dollar, 43 cents are spent on education, plus 22 cents of the school's portion of shared services, 11 cents for the municipal portion of shared services, 9 cents for public safety, 6 cents for public services, 2 cents for health and human services, 4 cents for general government, and 3 cents for capital. I want to provide a quick snapshot of our current operating reserves. These are funds that the town is holding for general purposes. We have several other funds that have dedicated purposes, mostly for specific capital needs. General stabilization is our reserve to handle unforeseen budget emergencies, such as a major national or regional economic downturn. General stabilization is about $7.7 million. We also have an override mitigation fund, which is currently a little over $5 million. We expect to spend the override mitigation fund to zero in FY27 and FY28. The total amount in general stabilization is in line with our financial policies, which recommend keeping between 3 and 5% of the operating budget in reserves. We often look at other peer municipalities to see how we compare on specific benchmarks. In this 2025 comparison with 16 other municipalities on operating reserves as a percent of budget, Belmont is the red bar with the lowest percentage. Each of these towns faces a unique variety of fiscal advantages and challenges, and the current size of each town's reserves reflects that reality. However, this comparison highlights a long-term concern that our reserves are comparatively low, and this is a source of risk. I should also note that carrying large reserves can sometimes be a disincentive for voters being asked to approve operating overrides. I'll note that the fourth column from the left is Winchester, which had at the time of this snapshot $24 million in free cash, which is 3 times Belmont's free cash balance at that time. Winchester voters recently voted down an override. This slide shows a very, very high-level picture of our expenditures and revenues from FY23 to 30. The green bars shows each fiscal year's expenditures, which grow annually at a steady rate. The blue, red, and orange bars shows how we have managed to maintain a balanced budget from FY23 to FY27 through a combination of annual revenue, which is in blue, infusions of free cash, which are in red, and additional funding from the Override Mitigation Fund, which is orange or yellow, depending on how it looks on your screen. Note that in 23 and 24, large amounts of free cash were needed to keep the budget in balance. Starting in FY25, we institute a policy of treating $3 million of free cash as a recurring funding source. And you see those red bars become consistent in size every year, starting in FY25. Also in FY25, we see the blue bar increase in size due to this passage of the April 24 override. That additional revenue allowed us to maintain a balanced budget in FY25 and FY26 with only our regular revenue sources and that $3 million of free cash. But in FY27 and FY28, we are using the Override Mitigation Fund to keep the budget in balance. The FY28 budget is actually slightly out of balance by a currently projected $700,000. But we will work in the coming year to get that budget into balance by the time town meeting needs to approve that budget a year from now. But notice that starting in FY29, the gap gets much larger. Once the Override Mitigation Fund has been spent, the absence of that funding source plus the continual growth in spending leads to an estimated $7 million budget gap in FY29 and even larger in FY30. It is very likely that we will need to ask voters to approve an operating override for the FY29 budget, likely April of 2028, 2 years from now. I want to note that I showed this exact same slide last year and no changes are needed this year. We continue on the same budget framework that we first adopted more than 2 years ago in the run-up to the 2024 override. The goal was for spending to increase at targeted growth rates and to use dedicated reserves to keep that override last us for at least 3 years. This FY27 budget is the third annual budget since that override, and it appears likely that we will be able to add a fourth annual budget before the next override is needed. We remain on target thanks to the good work of all the committees that do budget planning: the Warrant Committee, Select Board, School Committee, Comprehensive Capital Budget Committee, and the Multi-Year Budget Advisory Committee, plus the municipal and school administrative staff. I particularly want to thank and single out the School Committee, led by Chair Megan Moriarty and Finance Subcommittee Chair Amy Zuccarello, and the school administration, led by Superintendent Dr. Jill Geiser and Finance Director Tony DiColigiero, for their work in delivering a school budget that balances student needs with meeting our multi-year budget targets. Next, I want to go through the 10 individual FY27 appropriation votes the town meeting will take on June 8 or June 10. For each of these appropriations, there are multiple levels of detail publicly available. But for this presentation, I will walk through them at a fairly high level. The Warrant Committee report goes through these with more detail, and full detail is available in the town administrators and school department budgets. Links are at the end of this presentation. Also, you should be aware the town meeting votes the total appropriation. This sets the upper limit for spending in each of these budget categories. Actual spending might vary from the individual lines of the detailed budget, as long as the appropriation for the category does not exceed the dollar figure approved by town meeting. The general government appropriation funds these 7 departments that are central to the core functions of town government. Key points to know about this appropriation. The town clerk's budget is up to fund 2 additional elections this fiscal year compared to last year. The town administrator's budget adds 1 FTE to handle the separation of the assistant town administrator and chief financial officer roles into 2 separate positions. Information technology continues to be a high priority, adding a web and social media coordinator and improving hardware and network reliability. Human resources is increasing because it includes a placeholder salary reserve to account for negotiations with municipal employee unions. Pension funding is set by the Belmont Retirement Board, which is an independent body. The current funding schedule set by the Retirement Board increases our contribution by 2.5% annually. Our pension obligation is now 76% funded, and we are on track to fully fund the pension fund by FY32. When we reach that point, our annual pension appropriation will drop significantly, freeing up resources for other priorities. Employee and retiree benefits are up significantly this year, driven by a spike in health insurance costs. We are not alone in dealing with higher insurance costs, and we are moving to deal with this issue. We have operated a self-insured health insurance plan for years, but the Select Board has voted to shift to the state's health insurance plan managed by the Group Insurance Commission, GIC, effective January 1, 2027. In the long run, this move should benefit the town financially, but in the short run, winding down the town's health insurance trust and shifting to a wider roster of health insurance plans under the GIC creates fiscal uncertainty. The public facilities budget pays for compensation and expenses for the facilities department, which manages all town and school buildings. This budget goes up significantly, but over $500,000 of this increase is due to a shift of the plant operations at both the library and rink into the facilities budget. I'll note this shift again when we get to the library budget. Some of the facilities increase is due to rising baseline utility costs in the fully electrified library and rink buildings. These costs will be partially offset by the solar arrays on both buildings. The public safety budget is growing very modestly due to limited growth in both police and fire departments. Compensation costs are static to reflect the hiring of new staff at lower salary steps. Union contracts are not yet settled. Once they are, increased salary expenses will be transferred here from the salary reserve elsewhere in the budget. The Belmont Public Schools appropriation is about $74 million, about 43% of the entire town operating budget. I'm starting with this slide showing the full $88 million of school funding, with the extra $14 million coming from grants and revolving funds. The town meeting appropriation covers only that $74 million, which is about 84% of the total school budget. I'm going to repeat the point that I made earlier in the presentation about the growth in the education budget. This slide shows the general fund increasing by 4.8%, but the benefit costs for the added school FTEs are covered under the shared services budget, a total of about $375,000 additional dollars. If those additional staff benefit expenses were included in the school budget, it would grow by 5.3%, which is in line with the multi-year target for that budget. Next, here is that $74 million general fund school budget broken out by major categories. While overall enrollment has stabilized, we are seeing an increase in student needs, and the budget reflects the response to those needs. The regular instruction budget has remained relatively flat, reflecting the work of the school department to respond to shifts in grade-by-grade enrollments with staff reallocations. Special instruction includes a significant increase in staffing to serve these students in district, relying less on contracted services or out-of-district placements. It's impossible to summarize a complex budget of this size in a few sentences, so I'll note there is an excellent summary of the education budget in the Warrant Committee report, and that report ends with a 7-page appendix written by Warrant Committee member Andrew Fleming, with a wealth of information on how the school budget works. The regional schools appropriation covers the students that we have enrolled at Minuteman and Medford Vocational Technical Schools. Since we left the Minuteman district, we have a relatively small number of students at these schools, 8 at Minuteman and 3 at Medford. The number of Belmont students at Minuteman has grown in the past few years, and that's the reason why this budget is going up. Estimated tuition at Minuteman is about $33,000 per student, and it's about $12,000 per student at Medford. The Public Services appropriation covers planning and building and the Department of Public Works. These budgets are not changing significantly in FY27. A few items to note here. DPW is combining 2 part-time roles, tree warden and conservation agent, into a single natural resources supervisor position. And to realize some budget savings, the yard waste collection program will be reducing the number of pickups in the summer and early fall. And we should expect to see a proposal to create a new stormwater utility in the fall of 2026 to separate stormwater costs from the Sewer Enterprise Fund. The Human Services appropriation includes funding for the library, health, and community services departments. Community services is the combined department that includes recreation, council on aging, and veteran services. I mentioned earlier that the shift of library plant operations to the facilities department. That shift creates what appears to be a reduction in the library budget. But if library plant operations are separated, the library budget is growing by about 6%. Both health and community services departments' budgets grow by modest amounts, reflecting the increased demands for the services that they provide. Finally, principal debt and interest consists mostly of debt service. The lion's share of this exempt debt is exempt debt that pays for borrowing directly authorized by Belmont voters, mainly the middle and high school, rink, and library. Because the voters approved these debt exclusions, the appropriations to pay for this borrowing are outside the Proposition 2.5 property tax levy limit. The good news is that this borrowing is complete, so exempt debt service has plateaued after several years of big increases. Belmont is also allowed to issue additional debt as long as that borrowing is paid for within the property tax levy. To preserve the ability to issue future debt to support capital projects, we are budgeting a steady $1 million for within levy debt service for FY27. This concludes this presentation. Again, to get links with more information on municipal and school budgets, go to tinyurl.com/Belmont FY27 or use the QR code on your screen. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you on the floor of town meeting.